Hello, my name is Mr. Beasley and welcome to this analysis of Percy Shelley's poem Love's Philosophy. This poem is actually part of quite a well-established form of literary poetry, which is probably best defined as poetry of seduction. Other well-known examples of this genre are written by poets such as John Donne, who wrote To His Mistress Going to Bed and The Flea, and Andrew Marvell, who wrote the poem To His Coy Mistress. And the thing that these poems have in common is that in them, the poet argues, almost like a lawyer, a clever, sometimes witty argument as to why he should be granted a more physical relationship with his lover. The poem was written by Shelley in around 1820, and the title is probably worth looking at before we go any further. Philosophy is to do with the study of truth. In fact, the word philosophy comes from a Greek word which means love of wisdom. And so what Shelley is saying at the outset is that he's discovered some fundamental truth about the nature of love, and he's going to share that truth with his lover. And this truth, as Shelley sees it, is that everywhere in nature things are joining and merging together. Therefore, if it's happening in the natural world, it should also be happening between him and his lover. The first example that Shelley uses is in the opening lines of the poem. The fountains mingle with the river and the rivers with the ocean. The images he chooses are not only drawn from nature, but they have an innocence and purity about them, which forms an important part of his argument for a more physical relationship. He employs a very gentle choice of verb here, mingle, because he's trying to argue that there's nothing to fear in moving their relationship to a more physical level. And I'm pointing this out particularly so that we can make a comparison with how these verb choices change in the second part of the poem. The second image, which forms the next stage of Shelley's argument, is the winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. And so the poet introduces a note of divine authority to his definition of true love. And he personifies these powerful, natural elements to show a comparison between the actions of nature and what he believes the lovers should be doing. He returns to invoking God's law in the final part of the first stanza as a way of adding weight to his persuasion and further suggesting that not only are his desires pure and natural, but also spiritual and sanctified by God. The stanza ends with a question, and this question is emphasised by the punctuation which ends the previous line. Since all things in nature join and mingle together, why shouldn't I with you? Which reinforces the idea that he is addressing somebody specifically, personally, trying to persuade them towards a more physically connected relationship. It's useful here to note the differences between the two stanzas. In the first stanza, the natural elements invoked through the imagery are water and wind, and these elements are transitory, moving, hard to get hold of. Whereas in the second stanza, the more solid and earthy mountain is presented, and this more powerful and purposeful tone is mirrored in the change in the verb choices, which move from the gentle mingle and mix of stanza 1 to the more determined, passionate and urgent kiss and clasp of stanza 2. And this tone is set right from the beginning of the second stanza with the use of the imperative verb see. Now, if you're not confident with this language feature, an imperative sentence is created when the verb is the first word of the sentence, and it just makes the sentence sound more commanding. The argument in this stanza gains pace, power and persuasiveness as it builds towards a crescendo using a technique called polysyndetic structure, which is basically where a conjunction is used repeatedly in quick succession. In this case, as I've highlighted here, the word and. And the point here is just to show how many examples Shelley can come up with to prove that, since this unity in nature exists everywhere else, it should also exist between him and his lover. He uses more religious imagery in the first line of this second stanza to once again make the point that his desires are sanctified by God. In the next pair of lines, probably the most ambiguous in the poem. And the first thing to say about these lines that I've highlighted in green is that you almost need to replace the idea of brother and sister with the broader notion of things that are related, in this case flowers that are of the same genus or type. So how do these flowers multiply? Well, they multiply by transferring pollen from one plant to another. Now, if we imagine that plants had the ability to reject or disdain its fellow plant, denying him that pollen, then the species would eventually die out and never be forgiven by God for doing so. So, this is an image of natural procreation that Shelley is using to argue for, again, a natural physical intimacy between him and his lover. The final images in this poem are those of sunlight and moonlight, suggesting that this sort of unity happens all the time, day and night. And the question which ends this stanza, separated like the previous stanza by a piece of punctuation which adds extra weight and impact, asks, what would be the point of all these things in nature coming together if we are not going to? Now, the connection that Shelley repeatedly refers to in the final three lines of the poem is that of a kiss. But I would argue that through the imagery of the flowers that we talked about just now, and the verb choices like clasp and mingle, he is suggesting a bit more than that. And so, the truth about love that Shelley is getting across in this argument, this persuasive poem of seduction, is one where a physical intimacy between lovers is natural, pure, sanctified by God, and examples of it can be found day and night all over the natural world.